Welcome to the CDR Policy Scoop. Great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure doing a podcast that I actually listen to. So it's good to be here. Thanks for
That's
having
what we like to hear.
me
Do you want to get us going, Eva, today?
Yes, I'm very excited to have you, specifically you, Harry, with us discussing the topic of nationally determined contributions, long-term strategies, carbon removal, climate policy in general, how it all ties together. Because I've been following your work in studying the long-term strategies and indices for a while, and I didn't realize that you have also written your PhD thesis on this exact topic. So when I realized that now preparing for the session, I realized who else would we have this conversation with if not you? So why don't we get started with some perspective from you, because we have the long-term strategies that the Paris Agreement is inviting the parties to put forward, and then we have the NDCs that are mandatory, that have to be submitted, and then into all of this, obviously CDR plays a certain role. We would want it to play a bigger role, but in reality, how does it all kind of interact when it comes to the big picture?
Yeah, certainly. So it's always I'm always pleased to hear someone's read my thesis. My PhD thesis. You spent such a long time on it, and then it sits on a shelf somewhere in the sort of digital archive of the university. So I'm really pleased to hear the thesis has been sort of picked up. We, it's a number of years ago now. I think last year I graduated from university in my PhD. So I'm now doing something slightly different. But in terms of sort of CDR and these multiple strategies, which is the sort of main focus, it was really sort of started as me trying to search out, well, I know these NDCs, I know these long-term strategies. How does CDR actually feature in them? These are meant to be plans. The NDCs are meant to be the plans to the near term, the 2030, now 2035. These LT-LEDs, you noted invite, that's a real key word in the IPCC language. This qualified language that's quite hard to understand. Essentially, I think the formal phrasing is strive to submit or something along those lines. So these are essentially optional documents for these parties to the Paris Agreement. But the long-term strategies are meant to be these visions out to 2050 that really describe how a party to the Paris Agreement, how a country is going to actually achieve net zero. The NDCs tend not to describe how they're going to reach net zero in the long term. So the LT-LEDs, which is by nature of being a longer term vision, tend to specify things like CDR more actively, simply because CDR is still thought of in that role of residual emissions, compensating for emissions that are otherwise occurring for the purpose of reaching net zero. So, what we found when I actually went through those LT-LEDs is, firstly, it's actually really hard to find out what a country is actually planning. These LT-LEDs are either really long or really short. They vary hugely in detail, hugely different models. But when it comes down to the detail, they don't specify much when it comes to CDR, especially the engineered methods of CDR, things like direct air capture and BECCS. And then the land use sector is another sort of, obviously, it's one of the mainstays in terms of CDR methods, but it's a real, often a mess in some of these documents. So trying to unpick what a country is actually planning and how that changes over time was sort of more the main objective of the PhD, but it's very hard to tell. It's a real tricky sort of subject to get your head around all these strategies coming out.
And when you kind of, having looked at such a broad range of them, probably more than pretty much anyone out there, what feeling did you walk away with when it comes to carbon removals? Did you feel that we need to adapt them quite a lot to be fit for purpose? Or did you feel that actually we already have a good framework here that points in the right direction? Because I remember looking actually at your thesis and this difference in some are pretty nuanced already when it comes to carbon removal, right? Some, as you said, don't talk about it maybe at all, or just so about one specific technology. So what was your feeling about how, fit for purpose they are or need to be?
Yeah, it tends to be a lot of the European states tend to be a bit further along in this thinking. So you read those and you are sort of encouraged by them. They have quite detailed plans. They have a good understanding of those residual emissions, so what CDR is there to compensate for. And often they're looking at some of the near-term options as to how to integrate CDR into, existing sites, for example, existing industrial processes, looking at what policies they should bring into near-term, and then how that all adds up to that long-term vision. What megatons, what kilotons am I expecting in 2050, 2060? There's a lot of states where they're simply missing the detail. So they publish a long-term vision, but it includes very limited modeling, if none at all. And often where we see some of the sort of cruder modeling, it often really emphasizes the land sector. So the land sector does a lot of work in these strategies, up to the point where, we as authors, I have a background in national inventory, so I'm used to putting together these numbers over time. And to us, they just simply don't make sense. They don't quite add up. So the land sector does a huge amount. We often talk about mitigation deterrence, things like direct air capture, this sort of common watchword that we see in the CDR space. But I think really my fear coming away from those strategies was the land sector. The land sector carries a lot of weight in these strategies and often does a lot of mitigation near term and has this more crucial function towards the mid-century of compensating for these residual emissions. So, I came away sort of really fearing some of the assumptions going into the land sector. And we tend to, especially in the CDR sort of discussion, emphasize the real sort of fears and assumptions around BECCS, for example, or around direct air capture. So for me, it was about kind of taking a step back and becoming quite worried about the land sector in reality. Often some of these strategies don't factor in, for example, the actual resource use from the land sector. So you have bioenergy, but you don't have any connection of that bioenergy to the resources that are being consumed from the land sector itself. So there's real gaps to this modeling. But nevertheless, you can do a lot there. You can see there's a point here about having a long-term vision. This is a useful exercise for these governments, but it tends just to be, because it's optional, because it's not mandatory, it tends to be an opportunity the governments pass up. And there's lots of scandals and lots of kind of nuances to some of the strategies that have been published that perhaps we can get into. But the one I'm most familiar with is probably Australia's and the UK, where I'm based. Those strategies have real challenges to the implementation.
So one thing that worries me is that we will keep seeing new iterations of NDCs because that the time horizon is moving and there is this expectation to have that ratcheting mechanism. Of course, we will need that to get to net zero eventually. But the long-term strategies are these strange documents. As you mentioned, some are very short, some are long. What is in there is, like whatever anyone wants to put in there. I think I've seen some that are just looking at different scenarios, not even concluding which one they're choosing to go with. There's no requirement to actually update these documents. And some countries have done it, which is great. But some of these, the first ones were submitted back in 2016-17. And if you think, that is like almost 10 years ago. And the way everyone was looking at removals, especially at engineered removals or permanent removals, was much, much more nascent.
What was there 10 years ago?
So, exactly. What was there 10 years ago? Some pioneers, I would say, and that's it. And that means that we need to see some kind of a regular update to to include the reality, because otherwise this one document that should show the long-term path that other documents then follow, like NDCs and then national policies that actually are there to implement these NDCs, I just feel like it's all kind of backwards and doesn't add up from process perspective. Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point you make, and for context, some of the articles I published from my PhD, they feature strategies from governments that were no longer in power, and so you have this real issue where the sort of architecture of climate policy isn't keeping up with political reality. But what that provides is perhaps sort of an interesting natural experiment. You know, a new government comes in, often they tear up the old strategy and they redesign it. That provides an opportunity to integrate perhaps a different perspective towards mitigation and CDR in the first place, but also an opportunity to integrate that newer knowledge. You know, some of these models include updated assumptions around the costs of CDR in the future, for example.
Is this what's happening?
So,
like in practice, it sounds nice when you say it, but is this happening?
In part, often what you see is that, take Australia, for example, they published a long-term strategy back in, I believe, 2019, 2020. They've since updated that, but it's a much more simpler document. It doesn't have a long-term modeling in it, and it's more or less a sort of addendum to their current NDC, 2035 NDC. So it provides some increased detail, but not enough. I think what's kind of interesting is when I realized this, you know, that perhaps these documents aren't as useful as a sort of evidence base as I first thought. I went into sort of depth on the UK model scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
What you have to understand about these strategies is that the government produces them, but often with the help of climate councils, government departments, often independent energy modelers, universities. So in the UK, we have not only the UK's official LT-LEDs, which was created by the then Johnson government, Boris Johnson's government. We have a lot of updated modelling coming from the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, from NESO, which is the National Energy System Operator. And you can compare how CDR features in their modelling over time. And what we actually see is a bit of a hype cycle. We see a sort of peak in CDR optimism, sort of around the 2021, 2022. And then we see things like BECCS quickly drop off in sort of overall megatons in 2050, for example. And it's part of that understanding why that drops off is actually more nuanced than simply CDR being in favor or out of favor. Sometimes because they have different assumptions around hydrogen. And there's a lot of BECCS that co-produces hydrogen in the energy system. So there's some nuance around sort of optimism, but also how this interacts in the modeling itself. So over time, I've become like a kind of detective working around trying to gather all these scenarios that are generated at both the national government scale, but also by these more independent analysts or climate change committees, those involved in a country who perhaps provide a little bit more colour to the government's own modelling itself, and that's a useful check on that government modelling. So it's interesting. They're certainly not as useful as perhaps it first appears, but they do add a lot to this debate at the national scale, at least.
When I look at kind of when I was looking at your PhD thesis a few months ago and analyzed it, the two things that stood out to me were one, the role of removals, but it's explained a lot by what you two said. The fact how outdated essentially a lot of these are, explain why it was only BECCS and DACs, and even they were almost not mentioned in most, right? It was mainly nature-based. But the other thing that really stood out for me was the role of residual emissions. Because I recall that it was less than 30, I think, long-term strategies that actually featured quantified residual emissions. And those were in the range of 20 to 33%. Whereas very often, and that was really so different from the range that we usually hear, which is 5 or 10, maybe 15, that might have to be compensated after 2050 with removals after net zero, right? So can you talk a little bit to the role of residual emissions? Because again, for me, this was one of the biggest insights, I guess, that I got from your thesis.
Yeah, I mean, during my PhD, the residual emission debate really took off. It wasn't really a term that I was even using at the start of my PhD, and the CDR sort of policy space and also sort of academic space moves so quickly now that suddenly this residual emission debate really sort of sparked up, and I wanted to try and I was sitting on this data set of huge amount of long-term strategies, and I thought, well, the obvious thing is to look at the other side of the coin, right? To say, okay, I've looked at all the CDR. What does this CDR do? What does it compensate for? So when we looked at those residual emissions, we analysed about 71 countries, essentially every long-term strategy you could get hands on. Only 26 actually quantified residual emissions at the point of net zero greenhouse gases. So some subtlety there around net zero CO2 and greenhouse gases, but nevertheless, a sort of benchmark for their net zero target. And like you said, it's about 21% of peak emissions. We're used to thinking about sort of 10% from the IPCC scenarios. It tends to be a bit higher when you're considering the peak emissions. So usually you have a natural peak in the time series and those emissions begin to decline. But a bit like everyone was saying earlier, there's a huge amount of variety in the scenarios. There's some from, for example, Australia. Australia's LTLS that featured only about 52% of their peak emissions as residual emissions. In other words, they don't even decarbonize the economy by half. The rest is all CDR or these international credits. Canada's a similar example. It has 44% of peak emissions. So again, a case where they really rely quite heavily on direct air capture in those scenarios. So there are examples where residual emissions are quite high. There's also examples where they're quite low, 9, 10%. That tends to be the average of certainly European states, at least.
Yeah, that was one of the big questions on my mind as well. I remember when I think you published that article in a journal that highlighted how high that level of residual emissions is in practice that the governments are actually looking at in the long-term strategies. And it was just so detached from the conversations we were having among, anyone working on CDR policy, or like even if you look at the voluntary market standards like SBTI, it was just, something very, very different. And at the same time, I didn't feel like it was picked up enough, because it should have been an immense reality check that the governments are looking at things completely differently. But somehow it didn't cut through the noise at the time. And I mean, that's one thing. And obviously we still have that problem, including the fact that, whatever has been put forward, the governments don't necessarily need to update it. They might be doing it, but not necessarily. But then coming back to your reference to the fact that what gets most focus when it comes to removals are nature-based removals. So it's mostly the LULUCF sector and removals from that sector. But when we look at what the scientists mean by net zero, they actually think about balancing fossil emissions with permanent removals. And then potentially balancing, for example, agriculture emissions with land-based removals. Does this at all resonate in this document the governments are submitting under the Paris Agreement, long-term strategies, NDCs, or this is completely, it's scientists had this in mind when net zero came up, but suddenly, but then eventually we realized that that message was never received by the governments.
Yeah, I think it's in my time and in reviewing all these strategies, I've never really seen much mention of geological net zero. This concept of like for like, for example. There's only one country that's sort of inadvertently done this, which is the UK. The CCC, the Climate Change Committee, does have a scenario in its most latest report where it says, look, this is more or less like for like. It's not stated explicitly, but I understand it's more or less the result of their modeling. It's kind of the happy sort of coincidence. Very little countries consider issues of permanence, although they might raise it on the side. But in reality, the LULUCF sector, the land use sector, is quite in trouble. We not only have this issue where perhaps countries are relying upon it, sort of assuming that they'll have that capacity for negative emissions in the mid-century. We also learned that there's actually a gap in understanding between what the IPCC scientists consider as the land use sector and how the governments are actually accounting for it. Not only that, we have a huge amount of uncertainty around the land use sector, and all the historic emissions are revised every year for national government. So in a national greenhouse gas inventory, we go back and we revise the historic time series over time. And when you chart what that historic time series looks like for each edition of the inventory from sort of 1990, the land use sector tends to bounce around quite a lot. It tends to actually trend perhaps in one direction. So if you take Germany, for example, Germany is seeing a huge collapse in its land use sink. And that really poses questions to its strategy for net zero itself. Finland's an example where we have a collapsing land use sector as well.
And what did if I can jump in there, because I'd love us to move to like, how does this affect policy today? And you can use the example you just mentioned. I'm very interested in Germany, for example, but we can take Finland as well.
Or Estonia, similar challenges as in Finland.
Because again, you're way more plugged in U2 than I am. My impression is the can is just kicked down the road. So I'm curious, like, what do you see as the exact policy implications that might derive from these developments?
Yeah, I mean, so much of the CDR debate is focused on this question of separate targets. I think that's a useful entry point, but it's really perhaps only half the debate. Things like geological net zero are fine, perhaps as a more academic argument. In practice, I don't see how the politics of geological net zero works when you have a country with a large land use sector, especially in non-X1 countries to developing countries. I can't see a case where the governments sort of give up a more diminished role for the land use sector in their climate policy framework.
Because it's too expensive, or because they don't like, why?
Well, the land use sector just does so much for so little money. Anything like tax and direct air capture are much harder to achieve and much more expensive as a result. So some developing countries, for example, really lean heavily on their land use sector to even expand their fossil fuel sector. So they achieve net zero by expanding the industry. Perhaps you can say that's justified for economic growth. But nevertheless, it raises real concerns for sort of greenhouse gas inventory specialists like myself, who really say, look, the land use sector is not something to be relied upon in any sort of practical means. This goes back all the way to Kyoto Protocol, where we were debating whether the land use sector should even be in the sort of global climate policy architecture. And there's quite serious debates about trying to keep it out. It was only because of political negotiation that it's actually in the first place. We could quite easily take it out again. But doing so is to perhaps upend all the progress we've done perhaps to date. So it's very hard to do.
Fascinating.
Well, I think there's also the challenge with political appetites around separate targets, as we're seeing now in the developments of the EU's 2040 targets. What were the expectations, especially when it comes to removals, and what was the actual outcome? So it continues to be a challenge. But when I'm looking at how things are developing, that we have these long-term strategies, which look very different. We have the NDCs, which are a bit more coherent, quite general, but they don't have separate targets for removals, and there is no guidance, I think, in the works even to require that. And then we have the next level of like policies that implement these targets in practice, and it feels like this is in practice where removals come up more these days. So in the EU now, it's in the context of the ETS, the ESR, and well, LULUCF obviously has its has its removal parts anyway, and we already tackled the challenges around that. But does it mean that in reality, it's this more practical level of policy development that will have to do the heavy lifting here, because these overarching, larger strategical plans, they just lack the detail and to really help scale removals?
I think so. I think I'm so pleased that part of the separate targets debate has really moved on to sort of policy. I feel like the mitigation deterrence debate has also moved on to the policy area as well. It's much more constructive to consider, what good is a separate target if you allow substitution of CDR in your ETS, for example. You can have mitigation deterrence in policy design as well as in scenarios. Today, mitigation deterrence has mainly been limited to scenarios. They're quite evident scenarios, but do those scenarios you play out in reality? No, they're scenarios ultimately. So I think this debate is much more healthier on the policy end. I'd much rather these national governments set out sort of near-term plans, sort of more of a end goal policy ramp for CDR, and simply national strategies. These national strategies are useful in outlining how much, broadly speaking, but they don't provide much detail in policy. And that's where the real effort, I think, needs to be sort of placed in CDR. It's trying to develop a bit more of a policy pathway towards your ultimate goal of net zero.
Be a bit cynical just based on what we've discussed here. I mean, what's the value in these long-term strategies in the first place? Because it reminds me a little bit of the corporate space where, corporate puts a 2050 net zero target and nobody cares, and nobody in the company actually cares because they don't have to do anything until 2045 or whatever, right? And in this case, it sounds like we have few of them. They're largely outdated. There's not a clear process for renewing them. They don't translate directly into policy very often. What's the point?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I would be perhaps more cynical still and say, there's limits to both the NDCs and the LT-LEDs, right? We've had nearly 195 parties put forward NDCs. We've had updates to NDCs, yet the 2030 emission gap hardly budged since 2015. I suppose the value in the long-term strategies has been refining perhaps our end-of-century warming projections for the policies. They often detail in much more detail the net zero targets that countries are actually intending to reach, perhaps how they go about that. So we are able to quantify, for example, the CDR gap, the LT-LEDs data that was developed as part of my PhD was part of the CDR gap that was recently published in the CDR, for example, a few years back. It's refined the end of century warming projections. So beforehand, the NDCs suggest it's around 2.5 degrees end of century. With the factored detail of the LT-LEDs from the net zero targets, we know it's around 1.7. So it provides a bit more color to our understanding of where countries are headed. Nevertheless, because they're optional, because they're so absent of detail, it does make you wonder what's the purpose. Perhaps there's a value in broadly thinking through the sort of dimensions of your policy goal, right? How much mitigation, how much deployment, how much CDR, all these different sectors, how are they to be transformed? But nevertheless, it's sort of playing around. We need to get on with the sort of real work of implementing. I don't think there's any substitute for that. There's no good plan that can be created that really substitutes for that hard work of simply deployment and figuring out what works at the policy end.
Well, there's one topic that we didn't get to explore, and we won't have time for it. But I feel is that we do need better guidance for governments in understanding how to go about designing CDR policy and how to feature it in all different strategies. I know that there have been different stakeholders trying to put out some documents, but the problem is then once NICE report is ready for the governments to actually go and use it. I hope eventually we'll get somewhere that is going to be seen as the guidance that will help governments figure out the best way forward. But yeah, I mean, action now, today, is what we need in practice. And these more broader documentations, I mean, they were clearly parts of moving the multilateral process forwards and important milestones. But I mean, in practice, the impact is on CDR specifically is still something that's, we'll need to see how it plays out. Not that much today.
We're on time.
Yeah, we're on time. Thanks so much, Harry, for joining, for sharing the takeaways from your years of work on this.
Thanks, Harry.
No, thank you. Thanks, guys. It's always a pleasure to return to PhD. So appreciate you taking the time.
Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.